he whispered. "Don't talk. Just listen," and saved the policewoman from the knife. An hour later, he did it again. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The rain had been falling since late afternoon, turning the streets into long black mirrors that glistened beneath the orange glare of weary street lamps. Water streamed in uneven rivulets along the cracked pavement, pooling near curbs, soaking discarded newspapers until the ink bled into strange patterns. Andrew Miller adjusted the fraying collar of his jacket and shifted the white paper bag in his hands. Inside were 2 takeout containers from the cheapest place still open this late, noodles for Sophie, and a pair of soft dinner rolls he had bought, not because he wanted them, but because his daughter had smiled at them the last time they passed the display case. His legs ached from another 10-hour shift that paid too little and left him feeling like his bones were made of lead. He kept walking, head slightly bowed, every step bringing him closer to the small apartment that barely felt like home, but was the only roof he could offer his little girl. The neighborhood was the sort of place where silence was not peace, but a warning. Boarded windows, tags scrawled on the brick walls, a single neon sign flickering in the distance like a dying pulse. Andrew's boots splashed through shallow puddles, the sound echoing in the emptiness. He tried to keep his thoughts organized, counting the dollars left in his wallet, adding and re-adding the numbers in his head. Rent due in 4 days, electric bill overdue, groceries running low. The bag in his hand felt too light, a reminder of how thin dinner would be tonight. He thought of Sophie waiting for him, probably sitting cross-legged on the worn couch with her schoolbooks spread out like treasures, her head bent over her drawings. That image, small and quiet, kept him moving forward even when his body wanted nothing more than to stop. When he reached the next corner, the flash of headlights caught his attention. A police cruiser idled against the curb, its engine low and steady. He might have ignored it. Police cars were common enough here. But the driver's door opened, and a figure stepped out, pulling up the hood of a rain jacket. The woman moved with measured precision, shining her flashlight along the side of a building, scanning each shadow with the patience of someone who knew danger could live anywhere. Andrew recognized the stance immediately, tense but professional, ready but not reckless. A young officer, probably not long out of training. He might have kept walking, kept his head down like always, but something made him pause just long enough to notice movement further down the alley beyond her. A shape detached itself from the darkness, barely there, just the faintest silhouette. But Andrew's eyes were used to reading the streets. The figure stood too still, too deliberately, as if waiting. For a few seconds, Andrew convinced himself he was imagining it, that it was just another man trying to get out of the rain. Then he saw the gleam of something metallic near the figure's leg, and every nerve in his body tightened. He felt the old tug of instinct, the one that said, "Walk away. Go home. Your daughter is waiting. Let the cops handle their own mess." But his feet stayed rooted. His grip on the paper bag tightened until grease seeped through. He imagined Sophie opening the door for him, imagined her voice calling Daddy, imagined the little smile she gave him when he pretended to be surprised at her drawings. If he walked away now, there was a chance the young officer would never see another morning. He would carry that weight home with him, and it would sit across from him at the dinner table, silent and unblinking. The officer, her name badge glinted briefly when she turned. Jenkins, it read, was halfway between her car and the mouth of the alley when the figure moved. It was sudden and swift, a lunging shadow with a glint of metal in its hand. Andrew's body moved before his mind caught up. The bag of food fell into the water with a wet thud, noodles spilling into the street. He charged forward, heart hammering against his ribs, his boots slipping on wet pavement as he collided with the attacker. The impact sent both of them crashing into the puddles, the knife hand jerking wildly. Rain hit Andrew's face, mingling with sweat, stinging his eyes. The man beneath him snarled, twisting, trying to bring the knife around. Andrew grabbed for the wrist, feeling the slickness of wet skin, fighting to keep the blade away from both of them. His shoulder burned. A sharp, hot pain told him the knife had nicked him, but he didn't let go. Somewhere above them, Jenkins shouted, her voice sharp, and then she was there, a blur of movement as she kicked the weapon from the man's grip. The clatter of steel on asphalt was swallowed by the rain. Andrew's chest heaved, lungs burning. The attacker struggled once more before Jenkins brought him under control, pinning him and snapping the cuffs onto his wrists with a sound that echoed in the narrow alley. For a long moment, Andrew stayed where he was, soaked to the skin, every muscle trembling from adrenaline. Then he pushed himself upright and looked down at the mess he had made. His dinner lying ruined in the gutter, rolls soggy, noodles scattered like pale worms. Jenkins rose, breathing hard, and turned to him. For the first time, their eyes met properly. She was younger than he had thought, her face pale under the streetlight, but her gaze was steady, searching his expression as if to understand why he had stepped in. Andrew said nothing. There was nothing to say. The rain kept falling, heavy now, washing blood from his sleeve in thin red threads. He bent, retrieved the soaked paper bag, and straightened without looking at her again. He turned toward the end of the street, his wet boots squelching with each step. Behind him, he could hear Jenkins calling for backup on her radio, her voice controlled, but edged with something that sounded almost like relief. Andrew didn't look back. The night swallowed him as he walked toward the one-room apartment where his daughter waited, unaware that her father had just risked everything for someone he had never met. The following morning, the rain had stopped, but the city felt just as heavy. Puddles still clung to the streets like bruises, reflecting a sky that couldn't decide whether to clear or pour again. Inside the precinct, Officer Claire Jenkins sat at her desk, staring at the glowing cursor on her computer screen. Her report from the previous night was open, but her fingers hovered over the keys, unwilling to finish the last paragraph. It was supposed to be straightforward. A routine assault, a suspect detained, a weapon secured. But nothing about the night before had felt routine. She found herself replaying the moment the man had lunged at her, the sound of the blade slicing the air, and the impact of a stranger's body slamming into the attacker before she could react. That image, a man she didn't know, soaked to the bone, wrestling in the street, refused to leave her mind. She wrote his involvement as briefly as the template allowed, referring to him as an unknown male civilian who assisted in subduing the suspect. The words felt wrong, as if they shrank what had happened into something small and forgettable. Claire sat back in her chair, her jaw tightening. Unknown male civilian. That man had quite literally placed himself between her and a knife. He had saved her life, and the report made him sound like a footnote. The precinct buzzed with morning noise, phones ringing, printers spitting out case files, colleagues trading tired jokes about night shifts, but Claire barely heard any of it. She thought of his face under the rain, the quiet determination in his eyes, the way he had picked up his ruined dinner from the gutter, as though that mattered more than anything else. She wondered who he was, where he had gone after disappearing into the night. Across town, Andrew woke with stiffness in his shoulder and the dull ache of bruises. The apartment was still dark when he eased out of bed, careful not to wake Sophie. He crouched by her small mattress in the corner and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. She stirred, murmured something in her sleep, then curled closer into her blanket. Andrew's chest tightened, relief, guilt, exhaustion all twisting together. He moved to the kitchenette, opened the nearly empty fridge, and stared at its meager contents before pulling out 2 eggs and the last slice of bread. He fried the eggs on the dented pan, the smell filling the room, and placed a small portion on a chipped plate for Sophie. He would eat what was left. When she woke, her smile lit up the space in a way no lamp ever could. She chattered sleepily as she sat at the table, swinging her legs. Andrew listened with half an ear, too preoccupied with the throbbing cut on his shoulder that had bled through the makeshift bandage he had tied the night before. He tried to move his arm without wincing, not wanting Sophie to notice. After breakfast, he walked her to school, holding her small hand in his. The sky threatened more rain, and he wished he had been able to buy her a new coat instead of the hand-me-down that barely fit her now. When they reached the school gates, she hugged him quickly before running off, and Andrew stood there longer than he should have, watching her join the tide of children. He headed straight to the construction site where he had been hired the previous week. The foreman eyed the ragged bandage on his arm and frowned, but said nothing as Andrew joined the crew. The work was brutal and repetitive, hauling cement bags, shoveling gravel. But it paid. Barely. He gritted his teeth and pushed through the pain. Every dollar mattered. Claire spent the better part of the day wrestling with the sense that she had left something unfinished. By the end of her shift, she found herself driving the same streets as the night before, scanning the sidewalks. She told herself it was for follow-up, a kind of field instinct that needed closure. But the truth was simpler. She needed to see him again. It was nearly dark when she spotted him on the construction site, a figure slightly hunched from fatigue, his shirt sticking to his back with sweat despite the cool air. He moved deliberately, as though every motion cost him more than it should. Claire parked nearby and waited until the crew began to disperse. When Andrew stepped through the gate, she walked toward him, her boots crunching on loose gravel. Andrew stopped, clearly recognizing her uniform. His eyes narrowed slightly, wary. Claire didn't blame him. A visit from the police rarely meant good news in this neighborhood. She noticed the bandage on his shoulder was soaked through, streaked with rust-colored blood. Something tightened in her chest. She spoke calmly, not to startle him, though in truth, there were no words that could capture the gratitude pressing at her throat. She offered him a small first aid kit she had brought from the precinct and a bottle of water. Andrew hesitated, his expression guarded, before taking them without a word. He crouched on the curb, peeling away the dirty cloth, and Claire saw the angry red line where the blade had grazed him. She stood quietly, watching as he cleaned and rebandaged it. When he was done, Andrew rose, nodded once, and turned to leave. Claire didn't stop him. She could see the weight he carried, not just from last night, but from every day he spent fighting to stay afloat. That night, Andrew returned home to find Sophie waiting with a drawing she had made at school. 2 stick figures stood under a big umbrella, rain falling around them, a small square building behind them, with light streaming from the windows. She said it was their home, safe and warm. Andrew smiled and praised her, but when she wasn't looking, his throat tightened. He sat at the edge of the bed long after she had fallen asleep, staring at the drawing. A week later, the foreman called Andrew into the office and told him there were too many men on the crew and not enough work. They had to cut hours, maybe let some workers go. Andrew's name was near the top of the list. He left with his jaw clenched, the envelope with his last pay feeling like lead in his pocket. That evening he sat on a bench near the apartment complex, shoulders slumped. He didn't notice the drizzle beginning again, soaking the knees of his worn jeans. The thought of explaining to Sophie that he might not be able to pay rent this month hollowed him out. When she padded over, carrying her latest drawing, he forced a smile. This time, she had drawn the same 2 figures holding hands under the sun. She said it meant tomorrow would be better. Andrew folded the drawing carefully and put it in his pocket, feeling the fragile weight of hope pressing against his chest. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would find a way to make sure she was right. The days that followed carried a restless weight. Andrew scoured the neighborhood for work, knocking on doors of repair shops, small markets, anywhere that might offer a day's wages. Everywhere, he heard the same answer. No positions, not this week. Try again. Later. Each rejection deepened the knot in his chest. He kept Sophie shielded from his worry as best he could, smiling when she showed him her drawings, helping her with homework under the dim kitchen light. At night, when she was asleep, he would sit at the table, staring at the stack of unpaid bills, trying to stretch numbers that simply would not stretch. The rain had cleared, but the air still smelled of wet concrete and rust. One afternoon, Sophie stayed late at school for an art project. Andrew was grateful for the extra hour to check on a lead for a night shift job, though the pay was miserable. By the time he returned, dusk had fallen, and he hurried toward the school, anxious not to be late. But when he arrived, the playground was empty. The last of the teachers were locking up the building, and the yard was quiet except for the wind, pushing at the swings. Panic shot through him like a jolt of electricity. He asked the teacher on duty, who said Sophie had left earlier with the other children. Andrew's mouth went dry. He started calling her name, his voice cracking, running along the street where they usually walked together. The neighborhood seemed to close in on him, its shadow suddenly hostile. He checked the small corner store where she sometimes liked to look at candy, then the park nearby. Nothing. Each empty bench, each stretch of sidewalk tightened the grip of fear around his chest. Images flooded his mind unbidden, news stories about missing children, whispered warnings about gangs that preyed on the vulnerable. His heart pounded as he turned corner after corner, shouting her name until his voice was hoarse. When he stumbled into the precinct, breathless and drenched with sweat, Officer Claire Jenkins was there. She saw his face before he said a word and knew something was terribly wrong. When he managed to choke out that his daughter was missing, something inside her shifted. She didn't wait for paperwork or procedure. She grabbed her radio and called it in, requesting immediate patrol support. The urgency in her voice brought other officers to attention. Within minutes, squad cars were dispatched to search the nearby blocks, alleys, and playgrounds. Andrew paced like a caged animal outside the station, fists clenched, unable to sit still. He blamed himself for every minute that passed. If he hadn't gone chasing a job, if he had met her at the gate, if he had been quicker, stronger, better. The litany of self-recrimination was endless. Claire approached him, placed a hand lightly on his arm, and told him they would find Sophie. Her tone was steady, but there was a fierceness in her eyes that anchored him for a moment. Hours dragged on with no sign of the girl. Patrol reports crackled over the radio, describing empty parks, quiet streets, no witnesses who had seen where she had gone. Andrew's breath came fast and shallow, his mind spinning with worst-case scenarios. Claire stayed close, guiding him from block to block, asking questions of store owners and neighbors, refusing to let despair take root. It was past midnight when one of the officers reported seeing fresh footprints in the mud behind an abandoned garage 2 streets away. Claire and Andrew ran through the dark streets, the beam of Claire's flashlight bouncing wildly. The garage door was padlocked from the outside, but faint whimpering reached Andrew's ears. His blood turned to fire. He grabbed a length of metal pipe lying nearby and smashed the lock until it gave. Inside, in the damp smell of oil and mildew, they found Sophie curled in a corner, her face streaked with tears. She ran to her father the instant the door swung open, burying herself in his arms. Andrew fell to his knees, holding her so tightly he feared he might hurt her, sobs tearing through his chest. Claire stood guard at the door, her light sweeping over the interior, making sure no one else was there. The evidence of careless cruelty was clear: crude graffiti on the walls, trash scattered around, signs that some older kids had turned this place into a hideout. Andrew refused to let go of Sophie, even as Claire gently asked him to bring her out so the paramedics could check her. The girl clung to his neck, and he carried her outside, whispering that she was safe now, that no one would ever hurt her again. His legs felt weak, his vision blurred, but relief coursed through him with every breath. Back at the apartment later, Sophie finally fell asleep against his chest, exhausted from crying. Andrew sat in the dark, the only sound her breathing. His hands shook as he stroked her hair. The fear had burned something into him that could never be erased. He knew now, with a clarity sharper than any pain, that he could not go on as before, scraping by, waiting for disaster to strike again. He had come too close to losing the only thing that mattered. Claire checked in the next morning. She brought coffee and stood in the doorway, seeing the drawn lines on Andrew's face, the protective way he kept Sophie near even in sleep. She didn't try to fill the silence. Instead, she told him she would help, not just with the case, but with whatever came next. Andrew stared at her for a long time, weighing her words. He had never trusted easily, not since the world had stripped him of so much. But there was something in her expression, not pity, not obligation, but resolve. She meant what she said, and for the first time, Andrew felt a fragile stirring of possibility, the thought that maybe he didn't have to fight alone anymore. The day stretched quietly. Sophie stayed close to him, reluctant to leave his side, her small hand clutching his shirt whenever he moved. Andrew found himself looking at the drawing she had given him days before, the one where the figure stood under the sun. He realized it wasn't just a child's fantasy. It was a promise, one he had to keep. That night, after Sophie finally fell into deep sleep, Andrew sat at the table and thought of Claire's words. He thought of the way she had searched for his daughter, as if she were her own, of how she had stood beside him when the others might have seen only another poor man in trouble. Slowly, painfully, he admitted to himself that accepting her help might not be weakness. It might be the only way to keep Sophie safe, to give her the future she deserved. When he closed his eyes, he saw not the garage or the lock or the shadows, but a glimmer of something different, a door opening, a path forward. And though the weight on his shoulders remained, it felt, for the first time in years, just a little lighter. Morning light seeped into the apartment like a reluctant guest, pale and thin through the dusty curtains. Andrew woke before Sophie, lying still for a moment, staring at the cracked ceiling. The events of the previous day felt both distant and sharp, as though they had happened in a dream he could not shake. Sophie stirred beside him, her breathing steady. He brushed her hair back gently and felt a wave of gratitude so strong it left him dizzy. She was safe. That simple truth was enough to pull him to his feet, even though every muscle in his body ached. When Claire knocked later that morning, Andrew was ready. Sophie sat at the table with her colored pencils, sketching quietly while Andrew poured 2 cups of coffee. Claire stood in the doorway, her presence steady, unhurried, as if she knew pressing too hard would only make him retreat. She asked if she could come in, and Andrew nodded, though the hesitation was still there, a remnant of years spent keeping strangers at arm's length. She told him about a possibility, a temporary position at the precinct, nothing glamorous, but honest work. There was filing to be done, supply runs, errands that freed the officers for field work. It would not make him rich, but it would offer steady hours and enough pay to cover the essentials. Andrew listened in silence, fingers tight around his cup. Part of him wanted to refuse. Accepting would mean admitting he needed help, stepping into a building where everyone would see him, not as another man on the street, but as someone under their watch. Yet when he looked at Sophie, head bent over her drawing, he felt something shift. He could not afford pride if it meant putting her back in danger. The first day was the hardest. Walking into the precinct, Andrew felt every pair of eyes on him. Some were curious, some skeptical. He kept his shoulders square, his gaze level, and focused on the tasks given to him. Claire met him halfway through the day with a small nod that said more than words. It wasn't approval, it was acknowledgement. He had taken a step forward. Days turned into weeks. The work was simple but steady, and for the first time in years, Andrew began to feel the rhythm of something close to normalcy. He rose early, prepared breakfast for Sophie, walked her to school, then went to the precinct. There, he sorted files, ran messages between departments, and occasionally helped translate for families who spoke little English, a skill no one expected him to have, but one that quickly proved valuable. The first time he bridged a language gap that allowed a frightened immigrant mother to explain what had happened to her child, Andrew saw the look of relief on her face and felt something deep inside unlock. He was useful, not just surviving, but helping. At first, the other officers kept their distance, some out of caution, others because they simply did not know what to say. But little by little, their attitudes shifted. They saw how dependable Andrew was, how carefully he handled each task, how he never complained even when the work was menial. Respect came slowly, but it came. A few began to greet him by name. One of them, a grizzled sergeant, even nodded approvingly after Andrew spent an afternoon helping clean out the evidence room without being asked. The paychecks, though modest, were enough to make a difference. Andrew found a small, clean apartment a few blocks from Sophie's school, just 2 rooms, but it felt like a palace compared to where they had been living. On the day they moved in, Sophie ran from corner to corner, deciding where to place her drawings, her laughter ringing through the empty space. Andrew stood in the doorway, watching her, his throat tight. This was what he had been fighting for, a place where she could feel safe, where they could both breathe. Claire visited that evening, bringing a second-hand desk she had found for Sophie. Together, they set it against the window so she could have a place to do her homework in the fading light. Andrew caught himself smiling more easily now, the lines of constant strain on his face softening. Weeks passed, and the precinct came to accept Andrew as part of its strange extended family. He was not an officer, but his presence became a fixture, the quiet man who always finished the job, who knew how to calm a frightened witness or speak to a teenager on the edge of trouble. His role became more than clerical. He began to mediate disputes, to translate stories others might have ignored, to notice the details that made cases clearer. Sophie flourished, too, her drawings growing brighter and more detailed. Claire watched the transformation with quiet pride. She had seen men break under far less pressure, but Andrew had taken every blow life had dealt him and turned it into resolve. One evening, after a long shift, she found him outside the station leaning against the wall, staring at the city lights. She joined him in silence. They stood there for a long time, the hum of traffic in the distance, until Andrew finally spoke. Not much, just a quiet observation about how the city looked different from here, less threatening somehow. The closeness between them deepened in ways neither tried to name. Andrew still struggled with moments of doubt, nights when he disappeared to walk the streets alone, wrestling with the ghosts of his past. But each time, Claire found him, not to lecture or scold, but simply to remind him he wasn't alone anymore. Slowly, he began to believe it. The day came when the captain called Andrew into his office. Andrew braced for bad news, but instead, the captain offered to make his position permanent. It wasn't a full badge, but it was a place, steady work, a measure of security, and perhaps most importantly, respect. Andrew accepted with quiet gratitude, and that night he and Sophie celebrated with takeout noodles and soft rolls, just like the night that had changed everything. Months later, the apartment had begun to fill with warmth. A small rug, a few pictures on the wall, Sophie's drawings proudly displayed. Claire came by often, sometimes just to talk, sometimes to share a meal. One evening she arrived with a box of pizza, and the three of them sat at the table, the room glowing with lamplight. Sophie chattered about school, Andrew listened with a calm that had been absent for years, and Claire smiled at them both, feeling as if this small kitchen table held something more solid than any badge or report could capture. As the night wore on and Sophie fell asleep in the next room, Andrew found himself lingering by the window. The city outside was still the same, loud, indifferent, sometimes cruel. But for the first time, it didn't feel like an enemy. It felt like a place where he could build something that lasted. He glanced at Claire, who was sitting quietly on the couch, and something unspoken passed between them. This, he thought, was what it meant to come back to life. Not grand gestures or sudden miracles, but quiet moments of safety, shared meals, a child's laughter. The journey had been long and brutal, but it had led him here, to a night where he could finally believe that tomorrow might truly be better. And as he turned off the light and stepped into the room where Sophie slept, Andrew felt, for the first time in years, at home. If this story moved you, don't stop here. Hit subscribe so you never miss the next one, and turn on the notification bell to stay updated. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are more powerful stories you won't want to miss. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.